got a summer seasonal job with the Forest Service. Said I'll figure out what to do when that's over, and 32 years later I retired from the Forest Service. So worked on the Medicine Bow Forest, the Black Hills National Forest, and then the Bighorn Forest was my last stop. I retired, and so now I'm part of the Fort Phil Kearney Bozeman Trail Association, and I'm actually serving as president of the association right now. So I'm glad to be here, and what I wanted to do today was do kind of a really quick and brief overview of history of the Bozeman Trail with some focus on events that happened in Johnson and Sheridan County, more or less, and some of the main characters who are part of this fairly short history. So what it really begins is up in southwest Montana, the history of the Bozeman Trail with the discovery of gold. John White first discovers gold around what's Bannock, Montana in 1862. And then what really prompted the rest was Bill Fairweather and Henry Edgar, who'd actually run down Alder Creek to avoid a crow hunting party, and they hit gold. In what was the area to become Virginia City, the story is that they discovered gold, and they said, we need to go into town to buy supplies, maybe Bannock, I'm not sure. They said, well, we're gonna keep quiet. We're not gonna tell anybody. So they go into town and they get supplies, and when they leave town, there's about 250 people following them. And so the gold rush is on, and Virginia City forms. So within just a few weeks, Virginia City grows to a population of about 5,000 people. And then in the area along Alder Creek and Bannock, what they call 14-mile city, about 10,000 people. So Virginia City becomes the first territorial capital, has the first bank, first public school, telegraph gets there in 1866. Gold miners, all the entertainments that come with a boomtown, vigilante groups, et cetera, et cetera. And by the 1867, 1868, the gold rush is kind of over, the main gold rush. And like most boom towns, by the 1870s, the population of Virginia City is down to a few hundred people. So a real typical story about the boom towns. But during the gold rush, you had to get there. And the quickest original way was to take off from the Oregon Trail and go up through the Bighorn Basin along the west side of the Bighorn Mountains. And that's a trail that Jim Bridger established and started taking wagon trains up there starting in 1864. Jim was asked, well, Jim, why don't you go up the east side of the Bighorns? It seems like it might be a bit quicker and there's water. And he said, well, if you go that way, you're going to have some Indian problems. So keep that in mind. Enter John Bozeman, and he was from Georgia. He left Georgia in 1860. He left a wife and 3 children there to go to the Colorado gold fields and never saw his family again. So he gets to Colorado and he doesn't, he's not lucky, it doesn't pan out, so to speak. And he heads to Bannock in January of 1863. Gets up there and he doesn't have any better luck panning for gold or mining for gold. But he hooks up with a frontiersman named John Jacobs, and they decide they can make more money guiding people to the gold fields than they can trying to be prospectors. So in the spring 1863, John and his partner Jacobs and Jacobs' daughter head back down along this side of the Bighorn Mountains to establish a route so they can guide wagon trains up to Virginia City area. They about get taken out by a Lakota patrol party about halfway down. They lose their horses, they lose all their food and most of their equipment. The Indians do leave them a couple of ponies. But they finally get down to, and so when they're doing the route, it's called the Bozeman Trail, but what they're really doing is they're following ancient Indian trails that have been used for millennia. The Crow have a name for this trail, which they translates roughly a trail that goes south. And they even have a site of importance to them up on the Bighorn River, which translates into the camp where men prepare to go south. That's how it translates from Crow. So for millennia, the tribes have been using this trail for trade, for coming in down here to hunt. So basically that's what Bozeman is following. Anyway, they finally get down to Deer Creek Station, which is in the present city of Glen Rock, Wyoming. And that's where Bisnet's trading post is. It's been there for a few years. The site eventually becomes a Pony Express station and an overland mail station, and then a military outpost from Fort Laramie where they would detach soldiers to protect travelers. So Bozeman and his partner gathered some people together who wanted to go up, and in 1863 they take a wagon train, first wagon train north from Deer Creek Station. And they get about as far as Rock Creek, just north of Buffalo, and they run into a pretty big Lakota party. And Lakota tell them in no uncertain terms that they need to turn around and go back, which the wagon train does. What they're doing is coming into ceded Indian territory, so the Indians take exception. Bozeman and about 6 other gentlemen stay on their horses, and they ride on to Virginia City. So the first attempt didn't go so good, but Bozeman's not deterred, so he returns again in 1864, and this time starts with a wagon train from Rosas or Richards Bridge in what is now Castle. And 4 pretty large wagon trains leave from Rosas Bridge and go to Virginia City in 1864. And he leads the first one. And it's actually a bit of a race because at the same time Jim Bridger's leading a wagon train up the west side. Bozeman gets to Virginia City about a week or 10 days before Bridger does, so it is a bit quicker. And then 3 other wagon trains follow, including the Townsend wagon train, which is a pretty big one, and they get up around KC and they have a pitched battle with Lakota forces, and they lose 2-3 men, and I don't know how many the Lakota lost. So the fighting has started. Kind of finished up with John Bozeman. So after 64, he quit leading the wagon trains, but he went into business, various business concerns. And he finally passes away in 1867 under somewhat mysterious circumstances. He and a business partner, John Cover, were traveling down to meet the military to get a milled flour contract. And they stayed at John Story's cow camp up in Montana, and then they leave from there. And the next night they pitch their own camp, and a day later, Cover comes in and says, "Oh, we were attacked by Blackfeet, and John Bozeman's been killed, and I was wounded." Story's men go out and look at stuff. It's a bit of a controversy. They don't see much evidence of Indians at the campsite. They wonder if John's partner didn't take him out. So that's unresolved. But anyway, John's short but famous life. So the Bozeman Trail's used between 1863 and basically 1868, and then it's going to be abandoned until the Little Bighorn campaigns 10 years later. But basically, the same corridor, but 4 different routes. So this is the 63 route from Deer Creek Station. And then they get as far as buffalo, and then they retreat. And then you get the 64 wagon trains leaving Wasatch Bridge. And then in 65, more of a military and wagon train route. And then the final in 66 is the military route, which varies a little bit, but same corridor. I always joke I didn't know much about the Bozeman Trail history until I joined the organization, but I knew a lot about Deer Creek Station because my wife's grandparents owned Deer Creek Station for a while. So I was getting indoctrinated. Anyway, a fairly short history, but a fairly spectacular history with a lot of important characters in there. So the route itself was a good route. Good water, good grass, good forage for the livestock, much better than the Bridger's Trail on the west, and shorter. The only problem with it, as Bridger had tried to point out, was you're going through ceded Indian territory. So originally from the Horse Creek Treaty of 1851, or known as the Laramie Treaty of 1851, it was ceded to the Crow, most of the Powder River Basin, with the Arapaho and Cheyenne to the south, and the Lakota over towards the Black Hills to the east. By the early 1860s and by 1863, the Lakota and their Cheyenne allies had pushed the Crow north up onto the Yellowstone River, and they were occupying the area. And what this was a real key resource for all the tribes, because this was still the prime buffalo hunting grounds. If you go along the Bozeman Trail corridor, you run across these big bison jumps, where they would jump the bison over the cliffs. So there's the big, there's one in Sheridan, in the park there. There's a big one down by Glen Rock, right along the Bozeman Trail, the Glen Rock bison jump. So a lot of evidence of all the tribes coming down up and down the trail and hunting bison. So real sensitive area for the tribes. And of course, they resisted the influx of Euro-Americans. So the tribal resistance starts about 1863. It's a picture of Red Cloud. A number of reasons, of course, why the tribes tried to resist and expel what they considered to be the invaders. Of course, the Oregon Trail, with all the traffic along there, it split the bison herds in half and caused a lot of problems with the bison herds. Military expeditions, immigrants who bring diseases that the Indians have no defense against. Another big one was the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where Shivington and his militia attacked a Cheyenne village in Colorado. And then in 1865, Connor brings his military expedition up here to try and protect travelers on the Bozeman Trail and fight with the Indians. The expedition for Connor is actually quite a disaster, and they about starved to death, but they do have a battle here with the Arapaho over at Manchester, which causes the Arapaho to decide they want to align with the Lakota and the Cheyenne who were hurt at the Sand Creek Massacre. So you have all these battles, and the tribes who had been fairly independent groups said, you know what, we need to coalesce and do something about this. And then finally, the last straw that broke the camel's back was what happened at the Fort Laramie Treaty Council in June of 1866. The military had called the tribes in and said, we'd like to cut a deal so that we can have safe passage along the Bozeman Trail and not be attacked. And the tribes said, we're actually wanting to listen, and said, okay, I'll tell you what, we might consider this. We have a couple of things that have to happen. One is you can't occupy our land, and we don't want any military in there. So if we can come to an agreement there, we might just let you have passage. Enter Colonel Henry B.B. Carrington. Carrington, for the Civil War, was commissioned for the Ohio and Indiana volunteers, and his job was to recruit volunteers, outfit them, and then send them to the battlefields in the South. And he was very good at this. He actually, as a young man, went to law school at Yale. And then when he finished, he moved to what was Columbus, Ohio, to begin a law practice. And there he met and married Margaret Sullivan. And she was from the Sullivan family. And it was her grandfather that founded Franklinton, Ohio, which became Columbus, Ohio. And her father founded Ohio State University. So they were very prominent. And Margaret and Henry and the families were good friends of the Lincolns. When Lincoln came to campaign in 1860, Carrington was part of his honor guard when he was campaigning. So a pretty prominent family. Anyway, he was very successful at recruiting volunteers and sending them to the battlefield, but he himself did not have any battle experience, which will become an issue for him when he gets out here. So after the Civil War, he re-enlists and was put in command of the 18th Infantry. And he comes out to Fort Kearney in Nebraska, and his orders from Sherman are to go on the Bozeman Trail, restaff Fort Reno, and build 2 new forts on the Bozeman Trail. So he heads out from Nebraska to Fort Laramie with 30 wagons, 200 mule teams, 200 horses, his infantry, supplies, a steam sawmill that they're going to set up so they can build forts, and all the supplies. And he gets to Fort Laramie in June, right when they're having the Treaty Council meeting. And the Indians have said, you know, if you don't occupy our land and have military. So Carrington shows up with his forces, and Red Cloud and the other leaders go, so you aren't being honest, we're leaving. So the more militant war leaders pick up their people and they leave, and they're going to resist. So Treaty Council breakdown, that was the last straw that broke the camel's back as far as any peaceful negotiations. And Henry with his forces head north. So in a couple of weeks they get to Fort Reno, which was established by Connor during his expedition in 1865. And it was still staffed. And the soldiers that were there were overjoyed to see Carrington show up. And they were all galvanized Yankees. Do you know what galvanized Yankees are? They are Confederate prisoners of war who then swear allegiance to the Union, and then they become part of the Union Army. So you have these former refs, galvanized Yankees, who've been out here pretty much under dire conditions, and they get relieved. And Carrington leaves, about 100 men there, and he takes the rest of his forces and heads north. And he picks up a field howitzer from Fort Reno to take with him, which is also kind of important. So on about June 13th, they get to Piney Creek, confluence of Piney Creek and Little Piney Creek, and between Buffalo and Sheridan, he says this is the perfect spot to build a fort. So they start construction. This turns into quite the facility. Fort Phil Kearney is going to be 17 acres in size. And it's going to be one of the few and only forts in the West that actually has a stockade. So if you think about the Hollywood movies, they all have stockades, but they didn't. But this one does. And by the end, the commander's house, the commander's office, officers' barracks, enlisted men barracks. So they have infantry and they have mounted cavalry. So the cavalry is in the right portion, and they have a hospital, a bakery. The sutler has a store inside there, so he's doing good business with the soldiers for all kinds of good stuff. At its peak, it probably housed about 400 soldiers, and probably another couple hundred civilians who were attached as woodcutters and water carriers and other things. It was a great spot for water and for grazing for their mules and their cattle and their horses. And you could see quite a ways around, so it was a good place to defend. The only problem with it was a long way from the timber. So they had to send timber crews out, civilian timber crews, and they set up pineries or wood camps up in the upper foothills to the west. And then they would have to bring the wood in by wagon and then empty ones back and go back and forth. So as we'll see, the tribe said, you know, if we want to harass these guys, we can harass the wood trains and start trying to pick them off. So they were working on Fort Phil Kearney, and later in July, he detaches about 120 men, and they head north, and they find a good spot up on the Bighorn River, and they build Fort C.F. Smith. A few acres in size, and it's adobe and wood. It never has more than about 150 men in it. So you've got Fort Reno reestablished, and now they've built Fort Kearney and Fort C.F. Smith. So then the tribes get down to business and basically have a number of heated battles, largely between 1866 and 1868. Historians like to call it Red Cloud's War. Red Cloud was a decorated warrior, very prominent. By 1866, he'd reached an age where he was no longer an active warrior, but rather an elder councilman, or maybe an our party's politician. So he was definitely key to bringing together the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and members of the 7 different Lakota bands, even including Alpacas from up here to the north. But there were other leaders who really led the battles, and a couple of the prominent ones, Little Wolf from the Cheyenne and High Backbone, or also known as Hump for the Lakota. And he was a mini Cajun warrior. But anyway, so they start coordinating, which is pretty rare for Plains Indian warfare. Usually, that's a very individual thing, and it's not about winning, it's about getting battle honors, bravery. But in this particular case, they coalesce and they start doing some planning and some group operations. I mentioned the Townsend fight, the wagon train fight in July of '64. Already mentioned the Treaty Council that went bad. And then a couple of the other major battles were the Crazy Woman Crossing battle, east of Buffalo, Fetterman battle, which is going to happen near Fort Kearney, the Hayfield fight up by C.F. Smith, the Wagon Box fight down by Fort Phil Kearney. A couple of years ago, we got an American Battlefield Preservation Grant, part of the grant we used for research in National Archives. And one of the interesting things is that people on these wagon trains, if they were attacked, and let's say their horse was stolen or oxen were stolen, they could file a depredation claim with the U.S. government to get reimbursed for the losses. So we found documentation for over 160 engagements between the Oregon Trail and C.F. Smith over a 2-year period. And so there was a lot of action. Some of the engagements resulted in fatalities, and some of the engagements were just, they stole our horses or they stole our oxen. But a lot of engagements. So things were hot and busy. So we'll return to Fort Phil Kearney. So Carrington's sitting there. He's got a bunch of raw recruits. A lot of these soldiers are recent immigrants from Ireland. and other European countries. Some don't speak English. And they've been outfitted with Springfield muzzle-loading rifles. So you have to load it, shoot it, and you're going to have to load again. In the documents, he kept sending letters to command saying, I have no ammunition, so I have no way to practice shooting. His horses aren't faring well. The American horses get out here, they don't fare very well, not compared to the Indian ponies. So they're not in the greatest shape. In the meantime, the tribes are picking off or attacking his wood trains that are going back and forth to the pineries to the west. And the tribes figure, maybe if we attack the wood trains and we send some decoys out, maybe, just maybe, we can get soldiers from the fort to chase us over Left Trail Ridge, and then we can ambush them. So they tried that on December 6th in 1866, and it almost works. And we'll talk about a couple of other characters. So at Fort Phil Kearney, Lieutenant George Washington Grummond gets there in October of '66, and he's got his wife Frances with him. Turns out that she's pregnant. He was decorated for his action in the Civil War, a lot of bravery, but he was very risky. And he actually got reprimanded for putting his troops during the Atlanta campaign at risk. Finally, and he liked to drink, so he was finally court-martialed for drunkenness and for abusing one of his junior officers. But he was a fighter, so he gets to the fort and he starts arguing with Carrington. We need to ride out and go after the tribes. So discord there. Then about a month later, Captain William Judd Fetterman gets to the fort, and he was commissioned into the 18th Infantry for the Civil War in 1861. Highly decorated. Siege of Corinth, and then the Atlanta campaign. So he was highly decorated. And so he comes out and he starts arguing with Carrington. And neither he nor Grummond care much for Carrington because Carrington doesn't have any battle experience. These guys are decorated battle veterans. And one of the stories goes, this is an anecdotal story, is that, don't know if it's true or not, but I hear it a lot, is that when they were at the fort one night in the sutler store, Fetterman is saying, I can take a company of men and I can ride out and take care of this Indian problem. The company's about 100 men, more or less, depending. And according to the story, there was a laugh in the back of the room. Everybody turned around and Jim Bridger was sitting there. And Bridger said, you may be a Civil War veteran, but you know nothing about fighting Indians. So anyway, you got that going on. So I mentioned December 6th. And so the tribal forces attack the wood train, and then they have decoys that they send out to try and entice the soldiers to chase them into an ambush. And Grummond and a couple of other folks go ahead and chase them, and they're quickly surrounded. Two of the soldiers are killed. Carrington and Fetterman ride out with a force, and they basically save Grummond and everybody else. So it was a near miss, with just a couple of casualties and possibly about 10 Indian casualties. But the Indians are pretty encouraged. So they said, we need to try this again with a little bit more organization, a little bit more leadership. And like a lot of battles that happened in the West, they had a pretty good ambush set up. Some of the young warriors wanted to be the first ones in, so they kind of blew the ambush idea. But anyway, they're pretty encouraged. And on December 21st, it works. And you have the Battle of Fetterman Battle, also known by the tribes as the Battle of the 100 and the Hand. And it gets his name this way. So the Indian forces are camped up here, and they start moving the warriors down. So the main camp stays basically around Sheridan with the families. And the warriors all start moving down, and about a day before they decide to spring their trap, they decide to send a holy man out to seek a vision to ensure that they would have success in this battle. So they send a holy man out named Crazy Wheel. He goes out and he comes back and he says, well, I've had a vision and I have a handful of soldiers in my hand. And they say, that's not enough. So he keeps going out and he goes out 3 more times. On the 4th time he comes back, he says, I've had a vision, I have 100 soldiers in my hand. About the size of a company. And the leaders say, that'll do. So we're good to go. So the basic plan is on that morning, they send out a small contingent and attack one of the wood trains, bringing the wood back and forth. And then they send out decoys, and there are about 6 to 8 decoys. The wood train is attacked. If you've been to the fort, you know that there's a high point called Pilot Knob, and they would put flaggers up there, and the flaggers could see, and they would flag down to the fort and say, the wood train's being attacked, you need to go relieve them. So Carrington calls Fetterman and then Grummond to his front porch and says, go relieve the wood train. And then here's the controversial part, and there are witnesses who say Carrington then said that by all means do not chase them over Lodge Trail Ridge. They say, okay, so Fetterman grabs the infantry and Grummond grabs cavalry units, and they leave the fort to go relieve the wood train. And the Indians send out about 6 to 8 decoys to try to entice them over Lodge Trail Ridge. Some of the decoys are Little Wolf from the Cheyenne, Big Nose from the Northern Cheyenne, Black Coal from the Arapaho, and Eagle from the Arapaho, and then 3 Lakota, American Horse, Sword, and then to lead them all, a young up-and-coming warrior that the Indian leaders were impressed with named Crazy Horse. So those are the 6 decoys, known decoys. American Horse is one of the decoys, and in some accounts, he's given credit during the battle that's going to happen to actually taking out Fetterman himself. And Little Wolf and Dull Knife, don't know how much Dull Knife was involved in this battle, but Little Wolf was definitely one of the decoys and one of the leaders. Probably one of the reasons this ambush is going to work is because there were 2 warrior societies that were really taking over and running the show. And one were the Bravehearts from the Ogallala, and then the Crazy Dog Society from the Northern Cheyenne. So they were kind of keeping the young warriors set and in place. There's Black Wolf of the Northern Arapaho. He was one of the decoys. And Little Chief was another one of the decoys for the Arapaho. So anyway, the decoys do indeed entice Fetterman and Grummond to chase him over Lodge Trail Ridge. And one of the stories goes that Fetterman started to hesitate, and Crazy Horse got off his horse and was looking at his horse's hoof as if the horse was lame, and they were shooting at him. And there's another anecdotal story that he finally kind of bent over and shot Fetterman in the moon, and that's what encouraged Fetterman to come over after him. Anyway, they do chase him over Lodge Trail Ridge and down on the High Backbone Ridge. So if you've been to the battle site, to the monument, you're standing on High Backbone Ridge, which was later renamed Fetterman Ridge. And they chase the decoys out along the ridge. So decoys run out here. Here comes the infantry. and then Grummond with his cavalry. And they hesitate about right here, and Big Nose, the Northern Cheyenne decoy, rides back and taunts them, and in fact it said that he rode up and bumped into one of the infantrymen. And so then they kept coming after the tribes. So they chase them down, and the cavalry go all the way down into the valley here, where they run into a big Oglala Lakota force who are waiting for them. And the idea that the tribes had is that the decoys were right out here, and if they felt like the soldiers were out on the ridge, that they would, on their horses, cross in front of each other, the decoys. And that was a signal for everybody to charge. So in preparation, you had Northern Cheyenne down here, and on the other side you had Minikoshu Lakotas over here, and Northern Arapahoes, and they're all in waiting. Oh, and so the total force that Fetterman and Grummond bring out there happens to be 81 men. So now they've got about 100 in the hand. And that includes 2 civilians, Fisher and Wheatley, and they were civilians working at the fort, and they had just taken in the mail brand new Henry repeating rifles, so they wanted to take their Henry repeaters out and fight Indians. So all the forces come out here. Wheatley and Fisher actually go down with about 6 soldiers on the back side of this little out here, and they get surrounded, and they're killed there. The cavalry get down, they run into the Oglalas, and they come screaming back up the hill. Now everybody's in full retreat. And you've got the groups of tribal groups coming up for both sides and shooting. I don't know how many Indian fatalities there were, nobody knows for sure. I always think the military overestimates the number of warriors fighting, and I always think they overestimate the number of Indians killed. But there was definitely some friendly fire killed because they were shooting from both sides and hit each other. During the fight, Big Nose, the Northern Cheyenne decoy, got back in the mix, and he went up to try and grab a cavalry horse, and he was mortally wounded. So his friends pulled him off over here to the side, and he said, "Prop me up on the side of the hill so I can watch the battle." And then he passed away. So his story is told often among the Northern Cheyenne. Anyway, it takes about 40 minutes, and the Indians had wiped out the force of 81 men. From the fort, they said that they heard one volley, and that, remember, the soldiers had those muzzle-loading Springfields, so they got one shot off, and then here it comes. The cavalry did have dispensers, and actually they took dispensers from the band. There was a military band at the fort, and they came with Spencer rifles, and Carrington said, "You don't need the rifles." But it didn't matter, so it took about 40 minutes to wipe everybody out. One side story was about the bugler, Adolph Metzger. The bugler was out there, and when they came to recover the bodies after the battle, they found Metzger under a buffalo robe and not mutilated. Now all the other soldiers were mutilated. And there's 2 different things there. One is tribal folks believe when you go to heaven, so to speak, you go as you look in real life, so they would want to mutilate people. The Cheyenne wanted to mutilate them, and it was a bit of a payback for what happened down at Sand Creek, which was a lot of mutilation. But anyway, the interesting thing is Metzger was untouched, and the oral history from the tribes was that they left him alone because he was brave, and he shot, and then he ran out of ammunition, and he banged people with his bugle before he was taken out. So that's the story about Metzger. that's just another view. So you're looking back at Lodge Trail Ridge. So the 4th, they heard one volley, and Carrington dispatched Lieutenant Ike with another group of soldiers and his field artillery. Battle started at about 11:40, and 10, Ike and his men got there about 1:30, and the battle was over. A group of the soldiers got back to where the monument is, so that was the last group, the last piece of the battle up by the monument. So that night, Carrington has to get word to Fort Laramie that this disaster has happened to him. And John Portugee Phillips volunteers to ride down to Horseshoe Creek Telegraph Station and then to Fort Laramie to get the news to him. He leaves that night. He's accompanied by Daniel Dixon and Robert Bailey. Carrington says you can take any horse you want, and he picks Dandy, which is a thoroughbred that Carrington owns. And they head out that night on December 21st. They ride during the night and they hide during the day, and there's a big snowstorm going on. They get to Horse Creek Telegraph Station on Christmas Day and give the news to the telegraph operator, and he sends it back to command. And Portugee Phillips keeps riding, and he gets to Fort Laramie on Christmas night in a snowstorm. And he goes into the, I guess, the main officers' quarters, and it happens that they're having a Christmas ball, so everybody's decked up. And he comes in underneath the buffalo robe, frozen stiff, to deliver the news that the massacre has happened. He's an interesting fellow. Portugee Phillips was born in the Azores. When he was 18, he jumped on an American whaling ship and got to California. He's tried the gold fields there. Then he went to Colorado, and then he went out to Virginia City. And in 1865, 1866, he comes down to Fort Phil Kearney, where he's working as a civilian water contractor. So he does the ride, he makes it, he gets a nice horse, and he gets $300. He returns to Fort Phil Kearney, and actually he is going to barely escape the wagon box fight. And later he's going to move south, and he'll set up a tie hat camp on Elk Mountain down by Saratoga. I think I recorded his camp and didn't know it. And when I was down there. And then he and his wife Hattie set up a hotel and restaurant over by Chugwater, which is real popular. So that's kind of John Portugee Phillips' story. Interesting fellow. So the aftermath of the Fetterman massacre, or as the Indians say, the Battle of the 100 in the Hand. So the fatalities, they vary in the cemetery at the fort. In 1888, those remains are going to be removed and taken up to the Custer battlefield, and they're going to be interred up by what's the current monument. And then in 1930, they're moved again to the current cemetery. So the fatalities, the soldiers from the Fetterman battle are up at the Custer, Little Bighorn battlefield. So Carrington is blamed for the loss in the Fetterman battle, although some people said he gave explicit commands not to chase the decoys. And then he is relieved of command that January. Now most people think that's because of this blame for the battle, but actually they were already going to be reassigned. 18th Infantry was going to be reassigned down to Casper, and they got their orders to be reassigned on December 21st, the day of the Fetterman battle. is kind of ironic. And then his orders to be reassigned south came 6 days later. So anyway, he was going to go anyway. So in January, he leaves, and his wife Margaret and their son Willie, and they head south, with Frances Grummond, the widow of George Washington Grummond, and they head south. And Commander Wessels comes up from Fort Reno, and he's in charge until July, following July. There are 2 government investigations of Colonel Harrington. I think last year we just published a transcript of the military court hearing on it. He's exonerated in both investigations, but the stigma never leaves him that he was responsible for the Fetterman battle. In July, Commander Smith arrives at Fort Phil Kearney to take over. And he is a Civil War veteran, highly decorated, highly competent officer. And he brings with him new infantry, new officers who are experienced. Smith is a West Pointer and was in a lot of battles in the Civil War. But the most important thing that he brings with him on July 13th is a shipment of Allen-modified Spencer single-shot rifles to replace the muzzle-loading Springfields. And that becomes important. So the fighting continues, and then the 2 last big fights on August 1st in 1867, the following summer, the Cheyenne basically attack a hay cutting crew up by C.F. Smith. 23 soldiers, 12 civilians barricade themselves out in the hayfield. Cheyenne, Lakota, Arapaho, 3 soldiers killed, 5 wounded. The following day, we had the Wagon Box fight out west of Fort Phil Kearney, and they had the pineries out there, and then they'd established a little soldiers camp, and they call it the Wagon Box fight because to transport the wood they would take the wagon boxes off the running gear of the wagons, and then they would put the logs on the running gear and move the logs down to the fort. So they've taken the wagon boxes and built a little corral. There were 28 soldiers and 4 civilians there around the little camp. The tribal people don't call it the wagon box fight, they surround the white tents fight, because the soldiers had their white pup tents up. And there's a winter count buffalo robe made in 1903 by one of the Indians who fought here that depicts they surround the white tents battle. The Lakota and Cheyenne made about 4 charges. They attacked the pineries first, and leader of the groups attacking the pineries was Crazy Horse. And his mentor, High Backbone, who had led the Fetterman battle, also led this battle. So they attacked the pineries, and then they came sweeping across the plains this way towards the Wagon Box Corral. And the soldiers fired a volley, and the tribal folks said, nah, they're going to have to reload, and we got them. But they had the new Allen-modified rifles. And so the tribal folks were unprepared for that. Over the next 2 hours, the tribes made about 4 charges from about 3 different directions onto the Wagon Box. And they got really close, but because they had the new rifles, they couldn't overcome them. 7 soldiers killed, 4 wounded. And I don't know the Lakota and Cheyenne casualties, but heavier than the other battles. And then finally from the fort, reinforcements got there in the middle of the afternoon, and they brought the mountain howitzer with them. And they fired a shot into the side slope where a lot of the tribal families were gathered and watching the battle. And then another shot into the tribal folks, and the Indians did not like field artillery at all. So they said, we're done. It's time for lunch, let's quit, let's go. So it was kind of a standoff. But as a result of that, following year in 1868, the military finally says we got to stop this, and so they call the tribes in for treaty council at Fort Laramie. And many of the tribal people signed the treaty, and part of that is for the forts to be abandoned and for the trail to be discontinued use of the trail. So in the short term, Red Cloud wins his war. The tribes win their war in the short term. They watch the soldiers leave C.F. Smith. They watch the soldiers leave Fort Phil Kearney on August 2nd, and then leave Fort Reno. And as the soldiers left, Little Wolf with his shining groups rode down and burned the forts down. It's important to know at the Fort Laramie Treaty that Red Cloud did not come in. He said, well, I'll see, I'll watch and see. And plus he wanted to go do his fall bison hunt. Little Wolf didn't come in, High Backbone didn't come in, Crazy Horse didn't come in. So the real key leaders did not come in and sign. But in the fall, when the forts had been abandoned, Crazy Horse did come in and sign the treaty. So, quite a history about Red Cloud. When he came in to sign the treaty, it was witnessed, his signature was witnessed in person by Father DeSmet, who was there. So Red Cloud, once he signed the treaty, he said, I'll fight no more. And he moves up to the reservation in South Dakota, and he never fights again. So, just interesting that he led the one successful military campaign in the West against the U.S. military. Okay, I'm about done. There's a couple of good reads about this history. Margaret Carrington, who was at Fort Phil Kearney, when they left to come out here, Sheridan said, you family members, you wives who are going out to the fort, you should keep diaries. And she did. And really detailed. She had a lot of interest, a lot about the environment, the plants, the wildlife. She was enamored with the Crow Indians. So I still think this is a good read, and from a perspective that's not a soldier's perspective. So I think it's kind of an interesting read. The other one that's a good read is My Army Life by Frances Grummond Carrington, George Washington Grummond's widow. Do you notice her name? Frances Grummond Carrington. You probably know the story of it. After they all left, and the year after Margaret Carrington passed, or she passed the year after she published her book, and Frances Grummond wrote a letter of condolence to Henry Carrington, and they started corresponding, and they got married. Side note on Frances, so after they left, she returned to the South where she was from, and she applied for benefits from George being killed, and she discovered that he was married to another woman as well. So for about 6 months, George Washington Grummond was a polygamist. But anyway, so then she married Carrington and published her book. And there's a number of editions of this book. And Henry was pretty influential in updating the editions. And he was still trying to clear his name. So another interesting read, and again, not the usual soldier perspective, so I find this one pretty interesting too. They had, Frances and Henry Carrington had 3 children of their own. plus he adopted George Grummond's son, Willie. So in 1908, Sheridan Chamber of Commerce got federal dollars, and they had a reunion, and they built the monument at Fort Fetterman. So there's a picture of 1908 celebration, dedication of the monument, and you can see Henry Carrington in the middle holding his hat, and then his second wife, Frances Grummond Carrington, in the front as well. They invited Red Cloud, but he was about gone, and he didn't come. There's the monument, and there's the big gathering, and Henry gave a dedication speech, and that's in the book we published on Henry Carrington last year. Pretty interesting. So that's what we have today, the Fetterman Battlefield Monument. Last quick story, one of my favorites. As you guessed, I'm really pretty interested in tribal history. It's just my blast. But a number of years ago, Maryland McWilliams took Bill Tobble up there. And Bill, his ancestor, Bluefeather, was one of the warriors at this battle. And of course, we knew Bill from the medicine wheel and other stuff. They were standing up there, and Bill said, "You know, they got the plaque on." And they said, "What? What's wrong?" He said, "Read the last line." It said, "And there were no survivors." And Bill said, "Of course that can't be true because I'm standing here." And so it's kind of about adding the other perspective and their oral histories about what happened. The Wagon Box, the CCC built the monument there. And as you go through Wyoming, you can still find intact ruts. We followed out quite a few of these ruts. And then in 1914, University of Wyoming State Historical Society put up monuments. If you go to Glen Rock, you can still see ironworks for the Pony Express Station and the Deer Creek Station. Shaw's Bridge. You can go to Fort Reno, there's some interpretive signs there and plaques. Man, if I was a soldier at Fort Reno, I wouldn't have wanted to be there because you had to leave the fort and you had to go down to get the water to the creek. So I can just imagine those guys, let's draw straws to see who's going to go get water today. And then the battle at Crazy Woman Crossing, a couple soldiers killed. It was soldiers in a wagon train. And there was a pitched battle for a while. And then they were relieved by a force from Fort Phil coming south. Fort Phil Kearney, kind of where our organization is located. And special news is a couple years ago, the state parks got a grant from the Helmsley Foundation to build a new interpretive center, and it's done. And goes along with our bookstore there. We're having a ribbon cutting on May 17th, and the Helmsley Foundation will be there, and Governor Gordon will be there to speak, and we'll say a little something there. So if you have time, come down for the ribbon cutting. It's going to be about 11 o'clock on the 17th. And then the following day, Susan Badger Doyle, who wrote the book on the diaries of the Bozeman Trail. She's coming all the way from Oregon to be for ribbon cutting, and then we're going to have her speak on the history of the Bozeman Trail the following day on Sunday here. And we're holding it as a free public event. So come to the ribbon cutting or come see Susan Badger Doyle and talk about, travels to the fields of gold and the irons. And I can't get out of here without plugging our association. So you can check us out online. And if you're a member, we publish Lookout Magazine twice a year. That's part of the membership dues. We've got about 270 dues paid members right now. And then we just published a Bozeman Trail travel guide. And so you can pick that up and you can go to museums and sites that have interpretation all along the corridor. So something we do. And we got a bunch of events coming up. So we've got a wildflower walk in June. I do an archaeology fair every July at the fort. We always do a Wagon Box anniversary program on August 2nd. There'll be a cemetery walk in September. This year we're adding the December 6th battle. And Kevin O'Dell, the archaeologist who studied archaeology on this battle, will be leading that. And then 3rd and 4th of October, Full Moon Fort, our evening thing. And that's the one you have to buy a ticket for. And we use the proceeds to fund the Frontier Regulars, so it's our group that does the reenactments. And always do a Veterans Day program. And then finally, we always do a Fetterman anniversary program on December 21st. So all stuff that's coming up for us. So I hope to see you down there. And thanks for your patience. The journey continues, but I'm done. Questions? If not, yeah, go ahead.
Where is Richard's Bridge? It's not like...
It's down by the river in what they call Evansville.
Okay.
Yeah, so you go down to Evansville and there's a little park down there.
Where was Fort Reno exactly?
It's about 12 miles, I'm probably wrong, east of KC. So you go east of KC and then you hit that real sharp turn. Instead of going down the Lynch, you take the county road north, and that's about 3 or 4 miles. And the first thing you come to is a little interpretive stop for Reno Cantonment, which they set up 10 years later when they were doing the Bighorn, bringing folks up. But then you keep going and you'll hit the little interpretation for Fort Reno itself. And then you can turn around, and before you get back to the blacktop, go north on 6 Mile Road, and basically you're on the Bozeman Trail. And if you look, and it's on private, so you don't want to trespass, but you can see on both sides of the roads some intact trail segments as you go north. And finally, then you come to Crazy Woman Crossing. So it's kind of it's a beautiful drive. So didn't drive it. I'll tell you a Wyoming story. So I was driving this because I was doing a tour and I wanted to drive it myself so I could get So I'm driving up 6 Mile Road. And here comes a pickup truck, of course. But of course, you're out there, there's nobody for miles and miles. And he starts to slow down, and I see he's got Iowa plates. So he slows down, stops, and he gets out of his truck. I said, well, he's lost or he needs help or something, you know. So I pulled in and pulled out. And he says, hey, can you tell me how to get to Fort Reno? And I said, well, yeah, I just came from there. You just go down that way and that way. He says, yeah, I come out every year. I'm a member of this Bozeman Trail Association. And I said, well, it's nice to meet you. I'm your president. We were the only 2 people for miles. And we both laughed at it because you know that happens. So, anyway, thanks so much for your patience. Yeah.
Sorry, one more question.
Yeah.
So your dates at the beginning of your show showed Connor here in this area in 1864.
65.
It was 65.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he came after the Civil War?
Yes. Yes. He came after.
Okay.
Yeah. 65 and founded or built or established Fort Reno on his way north. Then he had 2 or 3 groups split out. And then he ran into the northern route over here.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.